September 17, 1876, Helena, Montana Territory. Margaret Lindström stood in front of her brother-in-law's cabin with 2 flour sacks, a splitting maul, and exactly $7 in coins. While the first snow of the season dusted the Elorn Mountains behind her. Her husband had been dead 3 weeks. His brother Eric had given her until sundown to clear out. 6 hours of daylight remained, and the almanac predicted the coldest winter in a decade. She was 41 years old, spoke English with a thick Swedish accent, and owned precisely nothing except what she could carry. The temperatures would drop to 20 below zero within a month. No boarding house in Helena would take a widow without references. The nearest homestead where she might find works at 43 miles east, and she didn't have a horse. But Margaret had spent her first 12 years in Dalarna, Sweden, where her father had been a charcoal burner in forests that made Montana look tame. She knew something about staying alive when the world wanted you dead. The problem wasn't shelter. She could dig a dugout into the hillside above Prickly Pear Creek in 2 days. If the ground cooperated, the problem was firewood. A Montana winter required for cords of split wood minimum for a single woman in a 12 by 12 space. That would need it to stay dry, or it had smoke instead of burn. And smoke in a confined space meant waking up dead. She'd seen it happen to a Norwegian family in '74. The conventional solution was a separate woodshed, 8 by 12 structure, milled lumber, tin roof, raised floor. Cost ran between $30 and $40 in materials alone. Margaret had $7.47 days before the first killing freeze if the weather held. She walked south along the creek until the canyon narrowed, and the north-facing slope turned steep enough that snow would pile 8 feet deep come January. Perfect! She found a spot where an old rock slide had created a natural alcove, semicircular, maybe 11 feet across, cut back into the hillside about 6 feet. The exposed rock face curved like the inside of a barrel. If she could figure out how to close the front without spending money. She didn't have. The hillside itself would shed snow and rain. The rock would hold heat from any fire she built, and the elevation put it above the floodplain that turned Prickly Pear Creek into a torrent every spring. For men watched her from the Helena Lumber Company staging area 200 YD downstream. She could feel their skepticism like a physical weight. By noon, she'd cleared brush and begun the real work. The creek bottom grew thick with young cottonwood and willow, nothing over 4 in diameter, but green enough to bend without breaking. She cut 12 saplings, each about 14 feet long and thick as her wrist, using a borrowed bucksaw she'd returned before sunset. The trick her father had taught her was this: greenwood bends, deadwood breaks, and the curve you force into living timber today becomes permanent tomorrow if you do it right. She drove 2 stakes into the ground at the alcove's opening, exactly 11 feet apart. Then she took the first sapling, buried 1 and 18 in deep on the left side, bent it overhead in a smooth arc, and anchored the other end on the right side. The sapling formed a perfect semicircle, like a wagon cover's rib cage. She did this 11 more times, spacing each arch 16 in apart, until she had a framework that looked like a tunnel entrance cut into the hillside. Thomas Brennan walked up around 2 o'clock. He'd been the foreman on the Northern Pacific Survey crew before taking a mining claim near Marysville, and he didn't suffer fools, Mrs. Lindström, he said, pulling off his hat. That's an interesting notion you're building. It's a woodshed, Mr. Brennan. A woodshed? He studied the sapling arches, which were already starting to set in their curved positions with no walls and no roof and no floor. Not yet, Margaret said. Ma'am, I don't mean to overstep, but you've got maybe 6 weeks before snow that'll bury this canyon. You planning to live through winter in a hole with a fence made of sticks? I'm planning to keep 4 cords of firewood dry, she said. The living part happens elsewhere. Brennan looked at the 7 remaining saplings she'd cut, then at the rock alcove, then back at her. Cottonwood and willow won't hold snow load. First storm will flatten whatever you're building here. Snow is going to hit the hillside 20 feet above this spot and slide right over, Margaret said. I'm not building tall enough to catch it. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. Just put his hat back on and walked away shaking his head. The sun was starting to drop when Margaret began the weaving. She'd saved the longest, most flexible willow shoots, hundreds of them, each 6 to 8 feet long and slender as a pencil. Starting at ground level, she wove them horizontally through the vertical saplings over, under, pulling each strand tight before moving to the next. It was basket making on an architectural scale. By dusk, she completed 3 feet of lattice wall that curved smoothly from the rock face on both sides. Gradually closing the opening, the weave was tight enough to block wind, but open enough to let moisture escape. She returned the bucksaw to its owner and spent her first night under a tarp stretched between 2 trees, listening to coyotes argue in the distance. September 18th brought frost that killed the last of the summer wildflowers. Margaret worked through it, weaving willow shoots until her fingers bled and the wall reached 5 feet high. The structure was starting to look like something half buried in the hillside, half woven from living wood, curved like an upside-down boat. A few miners stopped to watch. Most walked away confused, but Samuel Chen didn't walk away. He'd come from Guangdong province in '69 to work the Transcontinental Railroad, stayed when the job ended, and now ran a small freight business hauling supplies to mining camps. He'd seen things built 100 different ways across the continents. This design, he said in careful English, reminds me of structures in northern China. Earth and wood together. I'm Swedish, Margaret said, but the principle is probably the same. Work with what you've got. The curve is smart, Samuel said, distributes weight, but those willow shoots, they'll dry out and shrink. Gaps will open. Margaret had thought of that. Not if I seal them right. With what? Tar paper costs money, canvas costs money, clay's free. She said, and there's a deposit 200 YD upstream that's got enough structure to hold. Samuel tilted his head, reassessing. You're going to do it like a wattle and do wall. Something like that. He smiled for the first time. That might actually work. If the clay doesn't crack when it freezes, mix it with enough grass and manure. It won't crack. Margaret said, Monks have been doing it for 1,000 years. Swedes figured it out about 500 years ago. I'm just late to the party. Over the next 4 days, Margaret completed the woven wall and began the daubing. She mixed creek clay with dried grass, horse manure from a nearby stable, free for the hauling, and a little water to create a thick paste. She packed this mixture into every gap in the willow lattice inside and out, building up layers until the wall was 3 in thick. The work was slow and filthy and made her shoulders scream, but the structure became something solid. Waterproof, windproof, the kind of wall that would laugh at a blizzard. The roof was trickier. She couldn't afford mill lumber, couldn't afford tin, couldn't afford cedar shakes, but she could harvest bark. The ponderosa pines on the ridge above her site had thick plate-like bark that peeled off in sections 2 feet long and 14 in wide. She collected 73 pieces over 2 days, climbing trees until her hands were sticky with pitch. Then she overlapped them like roof tiles over the arched framework, securing each piece with bent willow pins. The bark shingles followed the curve of the structure perfectly. Rain would hit them and run off. Snow would slide right over the dome. Now people were paying attention. Here's what I need you to understand about frontier communities in 1876. Information traveled slower than weather, but judgment traveled faster than both. When somebody tried something new, especially a woman alone, especially a foreigner, especially someone with no land and no money, the community divided into 3 groups. Those who hoped you'd succeed, those who hoped you'd fail so they could feel superior, and those who genuinely wanted to help but couldn't figure out how. Margaret had representatives from all 3 camps watching her work. Father Heinrich Miller represented the skeptical religious faction. He was a Lutheran minister who'd immigrated from Bavaria in '68 and believed strongly in traditional social structures. On September 24th, he approached while Margaret was waterproofing the bark roof with a mixture of pine pitch and rendered that, Mrs. Lindström, the congregation has discussed your situation. We can offer you domestic work in exchange for a room in the church basement through winter. Margaret didn't stop working. That's kind of you, Father. What sort of domestic work? Cleaning, laundering, meal preparation for church functions. Standard arrangements. How many hours sleep? Perhaps 30, possibly 35, depending on need. And the room 8 by 10. Shared facilities. Adequate heat. Margaret climbed down from the ladder she improvised from pine branches. She wiped pitch from her hands and looked at the minister directly. Father Mueller, I appreciate the offer, but I'm 41 years old. I've buried a husband and 2 children, and I've worked every day of my life since I was 7. I'm not interested in becoming a servant in a church basement. Pride is a sin, Mrs. Lindström, so is wasting what God gave you. She said, He gave me 2 hands and a brain. I'm using both. Mother's face darkened. This structure you're building, it's inappropriate. Unseemly for a Christian woman to be living in a hole in the ground like an animal. I'm not planning to live in it, Margaret said. I'm building a woodshed. My dugout's 20 feet east. She hadn't started the dugout yet, but the minister didn't need to know that. This will fail. Mueller said, when it does, the church's offer may not stand. Then I guess I'd better not fail. Margaret said, if you're watching this because you value the kind of practical knowledge that people used to stake their lives on, the techniques that actually worked when there was no backup plan, and no hardware store and no calling for help, then subscribe to this channel. We're documenting methods that kept people alive in conditions that would kill most of us today. Hit that subscribe button to help preserve this knowledge before it disappears completely. By September 28th, Margaret had spent $5 of her 7. A box of 90-penny nails had cost 60. A pound of rendered tallow for waterproofing had cost 40. 2 yards of burlap for a door covering had cost 30. She'd bartered her late husband's pocket watch for a small sheet metal stove that was missing one leg, which she propped up with rocks. The remaining $2 would buy enough cornmeal and beans to get through October if she ate light and supplemented with whatever she could forage or trap. The woodshed was functionally complete. The structure measured 11 feet wide, 6 feet deep where it met the rock face, and 7 feet high at the center of the arch. Total interior space, approximately 66 square ft. The curved walls and roof created a self-supporting dome that required no internal posts or beams. Air could circulate through small vent gaps she'd left near the top of the walls, which would prevent condensation and mold while still blocking rain and snow. Now came the test. She spent 3 days cutting and splitting firewood, lodgepole pine mostly. It grew thick in the drawers above the creek and burned clean if you seasoned it properly. She worked from dawn until dark, splitting rounds with the maul until her palms blistered and then bled and then calloused over. Each piece got stacked inside the arched shelter in a careful pattern. Larger logs on the bottom for stability, smaller splits on top for airflow. Everything tilted slightly so moisture would drain by October 1st. She had 3.5 cords stacked to the ceiling, with just enough room to squeeze inside and grab what she needed. The first real storm hit on October 3rd. Not snow yet, just cold rain that fell for 36 hours straight and turned the creek into a churning brown torrent. The temperature dropped to 34, winds gusted to 40 miles per hour. Margaret sat in her half-finish dugout, still just a hole in the ground with a tarp over it, and watched water pour off the hillside above her woodshed. Every drop ran right over the bark roof. The curved shape channeled everything to the sides. Not a single leak, not one drop penetrated the clay-daubed walls. When the storm cleared, she opened the burlap door and checked the firewood, bone dry. She pulled out a split log from the middle of the stack and examined it closely. The wood's moisture content felt exactly the same as before the rain, maybe 14%. Perfect for burning, no mold, no dampness, no water stains. Thomas Brennan showed up that afternoon with an odd expression on his face. Mrs. Lindström, I owe you an apology. Margaret was digging out her dugout, throwing shovel after shovel of dirt onto a pile that would become her earthen roof. For what? Mr. Brennan, for assuming you didn't know what you were doing. He gestured at the woodshed. I inspected it after the storm. That's solid work. Better than solid. That's smart work. Thank you. How much did the whole thing cost you? Margaret leaned on her shovel. Let's see, nails, tallow, burlap, and the food I've eaten while building it. About $6.20 last I calculated. Brennan stared at her. I spent $38 on my woodshed last year. Milt. Lumber, tin roof, raised floor. Yours is better. Yours is probably prettier. Pretty doesn't matter when you're trying not to freeze, Brennan said. Do you mind if I bring some people by? I know 3 miners who need wood storage before snow flies and they're all short on cash. Bring them, Margaret said. Word spread the way it does in small communities by mid-October. Margaret had shown 7 different people how to build a bent sapling woodshed. She didn't charge for the information, just asked that if anyone had extra food or supplies, she'd appreciate the help. She ended up with more dried beans, smoked venison, and cornmeal than she could eat in 3 months. One mining engineer gave her a wool blanket that had belonged to his late mother. Samuel Chen brought her a bundle of Chinese newspapers to use as insulation along with a jar of preserved vegetables his wife had put up. The community had shifted around her. She'd proven something that mattered more than social propriety or religious approval. She could solve problems with intelligence and work in a place where survival was never guaranteed. That counted for everything. The real winter arrived on November 12th. The temperature dropped to 8 below zero overnight. 6 inches of snow fell, then another 8 in, then another 12. The wind screamed down from the Continental Divide at 60 miles per hour, creating drifts that buried fence lines and made the Helena Road impassable. For 3 days, this was the weather that killed people who weren't prepared, the cold that found every gap in every wall, the wind that sucked heat from any structure that wasn't built right. Margaret's dugout held steady at 48 inside without any fire burning, just from the Earth's thermal mass. When she needed heat for cooking or warmth, she fed the little 3-leg stove with splits from her woodshed. Every piece burned clean and hot because it had stayed absolutely dry. But there was a crisis coming that had nothing to do with her own survival. On November 19th, a family of Swedish immigrants, the Johanssons, arrived in Helena after a disastrous journey from Minnesota. They'd been promised homestead land by a speculator who turned out to be selling parcels he didn't own. They had no money, 3 children under the age of 8, and winter already locked down hard. The father, Lars, had developed a cough that sounded like it was tearing him apart from the inside. The mother, Karen, was 6 months pregnant and exhausted to the point of collapse. Father Mueller put them in the church basement temporarily, but he made it clear they couldn't stay past Christmas. The basement was needed for church functions, and besides, able-bodied people needed to provide for themselves. The subtext was obvious. Lars was too sick to work, Karen was too pregnant to work, and the children were too young to be useful. Margaret heard about this from Samuel Chen, who'd been hired to haul the family's meager belongings from the train station. She walked to the church that evening and found Karen trying to comfort her children in a dim, cold room that smelled like mildew and defeat. How much firewood do you have? Margaret asked. Karen looked up startled. Maybe 2 weeks worth if we're careful. Lars can't cut more in his condition. You'll need 4 cords minimum to make it to spring. I know, Karen said quietly, but we don't have money for wood, and I don't know who'd sell it to us anyway with Lars like this. Margaret did the math in her head. Her own woodshed held enough to get her through winter with some to spare. She could cut more if she needed to. There was plenty of lodgepole in the hills, and she still had her strength. But the Johanssons were facing a death sentence if they didn't get fuel, and Lars's cough suggested he might not live to see spring regardless. The question wasn't whether to help. The question was how to help without making them feel like charity cases, because dignity mattered to people even when they were dying. I need workers, Margaret said, which was a lie. I'm planning to build 2 more storage structures before spring. 1 for root vegetables and 1 for tools. The pay is firewood instead of cash. 1 day's work from the children equals a week's worth of splits. They stack. I cut. Does that sound fair? Karen's eyes filled with tears. She knew exactly what Margaret was doing, but the fiction allowed her to accept. That's more than fair. Over the next 6 weeks, the Johansson children, ages 4, 6, and 7, came to Margaret's site every afternoon after morning lessons with Father Mueller. She taught them how to stack wood properly, how to read the weather and cloud formations, how to identify which trees would burn clean and which would smoke. She cut splits and they stacked them in the Johanssons' corner of the church basement. By Christmas, the family had enough fuel to last until April. Lars died on January 8, 1877. The cause had been tuberculosis, which nobody could have prevented and nobody could have cured. But he died warm in a room heated by wood his children had helped stack, surrounded by people who'd shown up because Margaret had shown them that helping each other was the only way any of them survived. Karen gave birth to a healthy girl in February. She named the child Margaret. Here's what the historical record shows for those of you who like primary sources. The Helena Weekly Herald published a short article on March 3, 1877 describing ingenious frontier architecture developed by certain industrious residents. To combat wood storage challenges, the article specifically mentioned barrel-vaulted structures of woven willow and daubed clay built at minimal expense, and proving remarkably effective in severe weather conditions. No names were given. Newspapers rarely credited women's work in that era, but the timing and description match perfectly. More significantly, the 1880 Montana Territory Census lists Margaret Lindström as the property owner with an assessed land value of $180, which was substantial for a single woman. The census taker noted her occupation as teacher of practical building techniques. By that point, she'd helped 43 families build various structures using salvaged and foraged materials. She charged based on what people could afford, sometimes cash, sometimes labor, sometimes just a promise to help someone else down the line. The arched woodshed design spread throughout Montana Territory and into Wyoming and Dakota. Variations appeared, some built with pine bark instead of willow, some incorporated scavenged lumber, some added stone foundations, but the core principle remained: work with natural curves. Use materials at hand. Build for the climate you've got instead of the climate you wish you had. If you're still here, if you've made it this far into a story about a widow building a woodshed in 1876, then you understand something important. This isn't just history. This is documentation of human problem solving under pressure. This is evidence that intelligence and determination matter more than money or status. When survival is on the line, subscribe to help preserve these stories. Hit that button. Help us archive the knowledge that actually kept people alive. The technical advantages were real and measurable. Traditional mill lumber woodsheds in Montana Territory cost between $30 and $45 in 1876. Margaret's design cost under $7. Traditional sheds required purchase materials, dimensional lumber, cut nails, hinges, roofing material. Her design required only nails and burlap. Everything else was harvested or foraged. Traditional sheds stood exposed to wind and required regular maintenance as boards warped and gaps opened. Her design was partially earth-sheltered, self-supporting, and required almost no maintenance because the materials moved together as a unit when temperatures changed. But here's the part that matters most. Traditional sheds kept wood dry by elevating it off the ground and covering it with a roof. Margaret's design kept wood dry by integrating with the landscape and using thermal mass to regulate humidity. Traditional sheds fought the environment. Her design worked with it. The comparison isn't even close. $7 versus $40. 7 days of work versus 3 weeks. One person versus needing help. And the performance was identical in both cases. The firewood stayed dry enough to burn clean. Why don't we build like this anymore? Because we don't have to. We've got hardware stores and lumber yards and Home Depot and building codes and inspectors and professionals who will do the work if you've got the cash, which is fine. Modern construction techniques are generally better, safer, more durable. Nobody's arguing that we should abandon engineered lumber and return to woven willow. But something gets lost when we forget that intelligence can substitute for money. That observation matters more than credentials. That the person everyone dismissed might know something that could save your life. Margaret Lindström died in 1903 at the age of 68. Wealthy by frontier standards, she owned 320 acres of land, a substantial house in Helena, and shares into mining operations. Her obituary in the Helena Independent mentioned her contributions to practical architecture and noted that she taught a generation of settlers the value of adapting traditional techniques to frontier challenges. What the obituary didn't mention, she'd started with $7 and a deadline, and she'd turned that into a fortune by watching how trees grew and remembering what her father had taught her in a Swedish forest 40 years earlier. The original arch woodshed stood until 1912 when a forest fire burned through Prickly Pear Canyon and destroyed everything in its path, but by then the design had spread across the mountain west. You can still find remnants if you know where to look: collapsed frameworks in abandoned mining camps, overgrown stone foundations. The occasional photograph in historical society archives showing a curved structure that looks almost like it grew naturally from the hillside. There's a broader principle here that applies to any time period, any situation where resources are limited and the stakes are high. The principle is this: the best solutions often come from people who can't afford to fail and who pay attention to how the world actually works instead of how they wish it worked. Margaret couldn't afford mill lumber, so she studied how trees bent. She couldn't afford tin roofing, so she watched how bark shed water. She couldn't afford to build tall, so she observed how snow moved across terrain. Every limitation forced her to look closer, think harder, and find answers that people with more money would have missed entirely. That's not romantic poverty. That's not noble suffering. That's just the reality that necessity sharpens observation in ways that comfort never will. And here's the thing that ties this all together: Margaret didn't just save herself. She saved the Johansson family. She taught 43 other families how to build better. She created a body of knowledge that spread across 3 territories and kept people alive for decades. All because she refused to accept that having no money meant having no options. That's $7. Woodshed was never just about storing firewood. It was proof that the system wasn't fixed, that resourcefulness mattered, that one person with enough determination could change the equation for everyone around them. So, when you're facing your own winter, whatever form that takes, whatever deadline is approaching, whatever resources you don't have, remember this: Margaret Lindström had $7 in 6 weeks and a brother-in-law who wanted her gone. She turned that into a shelter that worked better than structures costing 6 times as much. She turned that into a teaching career. She turned that into a legacy that outlived her by generations. The question isn't whether you have enough resources. The question is whether you're watching closely enough to see what's actually there. If this story meant something to you, if you see the value in preserving knowledge about how people actually survived when there was no margin for error, then do one more thing before you go. Click the like button. It tells the algorithm to show this to other people who might need to hear it. Every like is a vote that this kind of content matters, that practical knowledge deserves attention, that stories about real problem solving are worth more than entertainment. Margaret Lindström's arched woodshed kept firewood dry for 6 winters before she built a proper house and didn't need it anymore, but the principle lived on. The idea that you can work with what you've got, that nature provides templates if you're smart enough to read them, that poverty and isolation don't have to be death sentences. Those ideas mattered in 1876 and they matter now. The world has changed, the tools have changed, but the fundamental truth remains: intelligence and determination can overcome almost anything, and the person everyone underestimates might be the one who figures out how to survive what's coming. Margaret knew that, and now you do, too.